Seeking Daylight Part 1 Journey to the Underhill Gates. Narrated by Million Quinteros. Chapter 6 An Overdue Visit. Grandpa Andy left the train platform and walked in what he recollected as the direction of downtown. It had been years since his last visit. The city had collected more filth since his last trip, it seemed, evident by the thick smog that now hid away the tops of the city's taller buildings, and by the increased regularity in which he passed alleyways occupied by crudely built cardboard ghettos. He kept his tweed cap pulled down to his eyebrows so as not to draw much attention to himself. He was not an overly well-to-do man himself, but today he was wearing his good black overcoat. He imagined that he might have appeared of a means that would warrant an outstretched hand or the clanging of loose change in their metal cups or coffee cans. He felt bad for them, the children especially, but his pockets were just as empty as theirs. He kept walking, careful not to let his eyes linger too long in their direction. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and scanned the writing scribbled onto its corner, then turned his eyes to the numbers 412 on the double-hung glass doorway in front of him. The numbers were sloppy, each applied with a separate sticker holding its own crooked digit. Likewise, the old red brick building tilted out of plumb to his eye, as did the concrete stairwell just through its small foyer. He entered and started upward, taking each slanted step with a bit more caution than usual, until he finally had reached floor 7, door C. He checked the envelope again, then the door, and knocked. No one answered. He knocked again, this time whacking the door with the wedding band on his left hand for added effect. A door creaked open, but the sound was coming from behind him. Andy turned to see a short, bowling pin-shaped woman with an unlit cigarette hanging from her rather hairy upper lip. The cigarette moved with her mouth as she spoke. "Tommy ain't home," she rasped. Andy touched the brim of his hat with his right thumb and forefinger, bowing, almost as if to genuflect in her direction. "Thank you, ma'am. Do you happen to know where he might have gone? I'm his father," he felt it necessary to explain. The woman didn't see fit to return any such explanations. "Probably across the street," she said, and closed the door before Andy could thank her. "City folk, just as crude as I remember." Across the street was Dooley's Pub, one of the only single-story buildings that had remained untouched as the city sprung tall buildings around it. It was also the only wooden building left for as far as Andy could see. The boards were clearly in need of repair or a fresh coat of green paint at the very least. Inside it held a smattering of locals, mostly the black-handed factory workers who made its bar stools their home until they were drunk enough to venture to their own homes and families. Andy was not so out of place in such an establishment. He had seen his share of grimy taverns during the war, some that made old Dooley's look downright palatial, if he remembered them correctly. That had been years ago, but he still knew how to belly up when the opportunity presented itself. He placed a few dollars on the bar top to get the bartender's attention. "What'll it be?" called a short, stocky man sporting a clean white apron. Just a ring of hair remained at the edge of his otherwise bald head. "A stout, in a moment if you don't mind," Andy said to the bartender. "Sure, just bear with me for a moment if you will, sir." The man set a fresh pint glass under the tap and pulled back the handle toward him, starting the flow of a dark, swirling liquid into the glass, and then hurried to the other end of the bar where a woman was waving a $5 bill. Most pubs Andy had visited were dark inside, for ambiance, or because people felt more at ease with the idea of losing their inhibitions when their faces were harder to make out. If that was the case, people must have felt right at home in this place. It was like looking through motor oil. In this light, the 12 or so patrons neither looked strange nor familiar to him, but something about them did seem odd, all right. It was more of a feeling in his gut than what his eyes were telling him. He heard the sound of glass sliding across the wooden bar and turned toward the man as he served up his beer. "So what can I help you with, sir?" The man grabbed the appropriate amount of money from Andy's pile, leaving the rest. "I was told I might find Thomas Witherspoon here." The man gave Andy a suspicious look out of the side of his face. He should clarify. Andy thought again. "He's my son." The man nodded, put his finger in the air as if to say, "Wait here," and disappeared through the doorway behind the bar. Before Andy could finish his drink, the bartender returned, lifting the partition that kept the customers from helping themselves to the booze, and waved for Andy to follow him to the back room. "He's sitting right over there at the far end. Well, I suspect you will know him when you see him." He pointed Andy in the right direction. toward a group of 4 men sitting around a small, square table playing cards and smoking. The only one who looked up from his hand was Tommy, who, from the pile of red and blue chips stacked in front of him, appeared to be winning handily at whatever game they were playing. He threw his cards away, face down, and said something to the others as he heaped the chips into his pockets, slid his chair from the table, and made his way to meet his father by the doorway. He was taller than Andy remembered, and darker, like he couldn't lose the shadows as he walked. As Tommy approached, Andy could smell the stink of sweat, smoke, and whiskey. "Good, so you got it then?" Tommy asked, skipping the pleasantries. "I did," Andy replied. "And Lewis, you gave it to him?" "I did that too, but you could have done well by giving it to him yourself." His son had agitated him. Disappointed him was probably a better way to put it. What good is Lewis supposed to get from all that junk? All he wants is to see for himself that you weren't just a figment of his mother's imagination. Tommy's face remained calm while Andy laid into him. But as he spoke, the tone of his voice indicated that he was anything but. "It was time he had it. I saw what needs to happen now. For things to be right again below." "My God, Tommy!" Ashamed. That's the word Andy had been searching for. It came in an instant. "If you want to stay here out of our lives, scamming your way through life from the likes of these bums, suit yourself." Andy pointed toward the 3 men left sitting at the table, his voice dangerously loud. "But don't you think for a second that you, of all people, have any right to do the same to that boy. He's your son, whether you care to admit it or not." One of the men at the table had now set his cards aside and taken notice of the heated tone the 2 of them had been using. The word scam had likely raised his antenna. He pushed away from the table, looking annoyed as if he might be deciding whether or not he was going to get up to see what all the noise had been about. Tommy pulled his black leather jacket from the hanger next to him, then half-heartedly waved to the others without even turning to look, and pushed Andy toward the doorway. "That's our cue." The 2 of them stepped back behind the bar, and Tommy signaled the bartender toward the cash register, giving the man the chips from his pocket to count. "That's a pretty good day's work, even for you, Tom." The bartender proceeded to pull a large stack of 20s from the till and carefully counted Tommy's winnings. "Can you step it up a little, Bill?" The look on Tommy's face showed quite clearly that he wanted nothing more to do with doolies, and quite all of a sudden. "Relax, or else I'll need to start over and it'll be all the longer." Bill snapped back as he straightened and then counted the bills one at a time, finally neatening the stack by rasping them on the bar and handing them to Tommy. "Patience is a virtue, my boy." Tommy smiled toward the man and turned to leave, but not nearly quickly enough. "And where do you think you're off to in such a rush?" One of the men from the card game came up behind them. Tommy didn't turn to look. Instead, he calmly put 2 fingers to his forehead and closed his eyes as if to figure out what his next move would need to be in order to escape this mess. He maintained his pose for a full 5 count or so, until he appeared satisfied with his conclusion. His shoulders relaxed, and he turned back toward the man. "We decided it'd be best if you left the money here, since you're a cheat and all." The man was inching toward Tommy as he spoke, his cohorts close behind. Tommy stood still, oddly calm as the men came closer. Their intentions were clear. They wanted their money back. But even more so, they wanted to teach Tommy a lesson in the process. "There's no way anyone would have thrown away some of the hands you did, not unless you knew what we was holding. That's the way we've been figuring it," the man continued. "You've been figuring things now, have you? Never really took you fellas for a thinking bunch. I wouldn't want you to hurt yourselves." Tommy was only taunting them now, smirking as he said it. The man looked back to the others as if to say, "Well, I guess we have no choice then," and turned his attention back toward Tommy. Tommy stood his ground, calm, waiting. He shut his eyes tight again as the men pushed the bartender aside and rushed toward him. Andy should have yelled something to warn his son, but couldn't find the words in time. The first came at Tommy with fist clenched, throwing a flailing haymaker in his direction. But Tommy calmly stepped to the right, eyes still shut, as the man's thick forearm swung toward his head. Tommy snatched it with his left hand, grabbing and tossing him over the bar with the force from his right. The second man dropped his shoulder and came at Tommy, who again calmly collected himself and made 2 steps back toward his left, eyes still clenched, and spun out of the man's way just at the last second, like a matador might do to an oncoming bull. The man stumbled past Tommy, his shoulder hitting nothing but air. Before he had time to look up, the man was right in front of Andy, about to bowl him over. Andy reached for a nearby beer bottle and smashed it over his head, collapsing him to the ground in a heap at his feet. The last of the 3 glared toward Tommy, first in disbelief, then anger. He reached over the bar, snatching a pool cue from the hands of one of the now clamoring patrons, and snapped it in two against the bar top before pointing its sharp, splintered end at Tommy. "This ends now," he said mid-stride in full attack. The stick rose in the air and Tommy's eyes finally opened, staying fixed on those of his assailant. As the man swung for his head, Tommy dropped to a knee. The stick smashed into the neatly stacked bottles behind the bar, spilling the pungent liquid onto the floor. The man tried to make a second attempt, but Tommy suddenly yanked the stick from his hands. Now Tommy stood pointing it at him. The man's anger was replaced by fear, and Tommy jabbed the stick forward, just poking the man slightly in the chest. Out of options and outgunned, the man flung himself back over the bar top, falling to the ground, and then ran through the front entrance into the street. Tommy set the pool stick onto the bar and reached into his pocket. He began to count the stack of 20s, finally just eyeballing about where half the stack would be and slapping the bills onto the now alcohol-soaked wooden counter behind the bar. "Sorry for the mess, Bill. This round's on me," Tommy said to the others who looked on suspiciously. It was clear now that the two of them had worn their welcome thin. They headed back to the street, the sudden brightness from the sunshine blinding them as the door opened, just for a moment. Andy did not wait for his eyes to regain their focus. He was furious and needed to get a few steps away from where his son was standing before he did or said something he might regret later, even if that had meant wandering blindly into a busy city street. "Where are you rushing off to?" Tommy called, walking a good 10 steps behind him now. "Someone needs to make sure Lewis doesn't run off on some damn fool's errand. I made a promise and I won't stand idly by to watch your hand-forced fate to repeat itself. The boy doesn't deserve that, and I don't know that he'd even survive it." Andy's pace quickened even more, his son struggling to keep up. "If there's a fool among us, then I've got a great view of his backside," Tommy called out. "We have no say in the matter. You know that just as well as I do, old man. Besides, you're too late." Andy stopped and spun toward his approaching son, grabbing him by his jacket, clenching it in both hands, and pulling him close so as to understand the severity of his words. "What do you mean? What have you done?" "I've done little more than to send you a letter. It would appear that your complaint would be best filed with fate now." Tommy spoke calmly, as though he had long since realized that very little in his life had ever really been under his control. Andy spoke through clenched teeth. "What you've done is to serve your own interests, endanger your boy, and lie to your father, Tommy. This is what you've done. Make no mistake." "You shouldn't be so quick to dole out blame. There's no mistake about it. Lewis was always fated to finish what I began in the underground. If not now, next year, or maybe the year after that, but it would be done. I only wanted to be sure he had every advantage he could. That is why I sent the letter, that is why the time was now for him to have those things, and that is why I had you come here, leaving him behind to do what he must. It was the only way." Andy loosened his grip and straightened his son's jacket the best he could. "I just don't understand all this. I haven't understood a thing since you showed back up on our doorstep that day." He was tired of yelling, of fighting. He felt helpless. "I know, Dad. There's a lot left to explain, and I've never quite known where to start." Tommy's head dropped a little as he spoke. "You'll just have to trust that none of this has been to harm Lewis. I just don't know any other way around it." "I do trust you, Tom." Andy's eyes softened. He couldn't remember a time when his son looked so out of sorts, so unsure of himself. "I don't expect you to tell me everything. I hardly think I would understand the half of it. But if there's anything from your past, anything at all that could help Lewis, now would be as good a time as any, son." Tommy stood still, a blank stare on his face, for just a moment. He was unsure, Andy could tell, and it made Tommy's voice quiver when he finally composed himself enough to speak up. "Well, there is one thing." Can't wait to find out what happens next? No problem. You can grab the first 2 complete books now for free by visiting pjowen.com/free.